The Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. Story 1. The Crimson Gardenia. Part 1. The royal yacht had anchored amid a thunder of cannon, and the king had gone ashore. The city was bright with bunting. 1,000 whistles blew. Up through the festooned streets his Majesty was escorted between long rows of blue-coated officers, behind which the eager crowds were massed for mile upon mile. Thin wire cables were stretched along the curbs to hold the people back, but these threatened to snap before the weight of the multitude. In the neighborhood of the raised pavilion where the Queen and her maids of honor waited, the press was thickest. Here rows of stands had been erected that groaned beneath their freight, while rooftops and windows, trees and telegraph poles were black with clustered humanity. The king was tall and dark. A long beard hid his face. But the Queen was young and blushing, and her waiting women were fairer than springtime flowers. To a crashing martial air she handed him a sparkling goblet, in which he pledged her happiness, while the street rocked to the roar of many voices, and in the open spaces youths, grotesquely costumed, danced with goblin glee. Mr. Roland Van Dam secretly thought it all quite fine and inspiriting, but he was too highly schooled to allow himself much emotion. He had been hard put to obtain seats, and had succeeded only through the efforts of a friend, the Duke of Cotton. Therefore, he felt, the members of his party might have shown at least a perfunctory appreciation, but they were not the appreciative kind, and their attitude was made plain by Eleanor Bannerman's languid words, "How dull! It's nothing like the carnival at Nice, and the people seem very common." Her father was dozing uncomfortably, with his 2 lower chins telescoped into his billowing chest. Mrs. Bannerman complained of the heat and the glare, and predicted a headache for herself. Near by, the rest of the party were striving to conceal their lack of interest by guying the crowd below. Van Dam had been the one to suggest this trip to New Orleans for the Mardi Gras, and he felt the weight of entertainment bearing heavily upon him. In consequence, he assumed a sprightly interest that was very far from genuine. "This sort of thing awakens something medieval inside of one, don't you know?" he said. Miss Bannerman regarded him with a bland lack of comprehension, and her mother moaned weakly, the burden of her complaint being, as usual, "Why did we leave Palm Beach?" "All those dukes and things make me feel as if it were real," Van Dam explained further. "They say this Rex fellow is a true king during Mardi Gras week, and those chaps in masks are quite like court jesters. Maybe they sing of wars and love and romance and all that rot." "I dare say life was just as uninteresting in olden times as it is now," Eleanor remarked. "Love and romance exist mainly in books, I fancy. If they ever did exist, we've outgrown them, Rolly?" Being a very rich and a very experienced young woman, Miss Bannerman prided herself upon her lack of illusion. To be sure, she occasionally permitted Roland to kiss her in celebration of their engagement, but such caresses left her unperturbed. Her pulses had never been stirred. She looked upon marriage as a somewhat trying, although necessary, institution. Van Dam, being equally modern and equally satiated by life's blessings, shared her beliefs in a vague way. Manifestly, no lover could allow such an assertion as this to go unchallenged. So he rose to the defense of romance, only to hear her say, "Oh, nonsense! Do be sensible, Raleigh. Such things aren't done nowadays." "What things aren't done?" "Oh, those crude, primitive performances we read about in novels. Nice people don't fall in love overnight, for instance. They don't allow themselves to hate and be jealous and to rage about like wild animals any more." "The idea! Your father is a perfect savage at heart," said Mrs. Bannerman. She nodded at her sleeping husband, who was roused at that moment by a fly that strayed into his right nostril. Mr. Bannerman sneezed, half opened his eyes, and murmured a feeble anathema before dozing off again. It was plain that he was not greatly enjoying the Mardi Gras. "All men are primitive," said Raleigh, quoting some forgotten author, at which Eleanor eyed him languidly. "Could you love at first sight and run off with the girl?" "Certainly not. I'd naturally have to know something about her people." "Were you ever jealous?" "You've never given me an occasion," he told her gallantly. "Did you ever hate anybody?" No." "Ever been afraid?" "Not exactly." "Revengeful?" "Certainly not." She smiled. "It's just as I said. Respectable people don't allow themselves to be harrowed by crude emotions. I hate my modiste when she fails to fit me. I was jealous of that Baroness at the Poinciana, the one with all those gorgeous gowns. I'm afraid of flying machines, but that is as deep as such things go nowadays, in our set." Van Dam was no hand at argument, and he had a great respect for Miss Banniman's observation. However, he had been discussing something of which he possessed no first-hand knowledge. Therefore he said nothing further. No one had a greater appreciation of, or took a keener pleasure in, life's unruffled placidity than the young society man. No one had a denser ignorance of its depths, its hidden currents, and its uncharted channels than he. For adventure had never come his way, romance had never beckoned him from rose-embowered balconies, and yet, as the world goes, he was a normal individual, save for the size of his income. He had not lost interest in life, he was merely interested in things which did not matter. That, after all, is quite different. There were times, nevertheless, when he longed vaguely for something thrilling to happen, when he regretted the Oslerization of romance and the commercializing of love. Of course, adventure still existed. One could hunt big game in certain hidden quarters if one chose. Van Dam detested stuffed heads, and it took so much time to get them. Those unformed desires came to him only now and then, and he felt ashamed of them in an idle way. Now that the parade had passed, the visitors lost no time in leaving, and a dignified stampede toward the hotel occurred, for the gentlemen were thirsty and the ladies wished to smoke. It was due to their haste, perhaps, that Van Dam became separated from them and found himself drifting along Canal Street alone in a densely packed crowd of merrymakers. A masked woman in a daring Spanish dress chucked him under the chin. Her companion showered him with confetti. A laughing Pierrot whacked him with a noisy bladder. Boys and girls in ragged disguises importuned him for pennies. A very, very shapely female person, in what appeared to be the beginnings of a bathing suit, laughed over her shoulder, inviting him, with eyes that danced. "My word," murmured the New Yorker, "this is worth while." Ahead of him he caught a glimpse of Miss Banniman's aigrettes and the ponderous figure of her father. But the gaiety of the carnival crowd had infected him, and he was loath to leave it for the Grunewald, whither his friends were bound with the unerring directness of thirsty millionaires. It was a brilliant, gorgeous afternoon. The streets were alive with color. Somewhere through this crowd, the young man idly reflected, adventure, even romance, might be stalking, if such things really existed. So he decided to linger. To be quite truthful, Van Dam's decision was made, not with any faintest idea of encountering either romance or adventure, but because a slight indigestion made the thought of a gin fizz or a julep unbearable at the moment. As he continued to move with the throng, the butt of badinage and the target for impudent glances, he felt a desire to be of it and in it. He yielded himself to a most indiscreet impulse. Assuring himself that he was unobserved, he stepped into a store, purchased a plain black domino and mask, donned them, and then fell in with the procession once more, dimly amused at his folly, vaguely surprised at his impropriety. But now that he was one of the revelers, he was no longer an object of their attentions. They paid no heed to him, and he soon became bored. He engaged himself in conversation with an old flower woman, and, as she had only a solitary gardenia left in her tray, he bought it in order that she might go home. He pinned the blossom on the left breast of his domino, and wandered to the nearest corner to watch the crowds flow past. He had been there but a moment when a girl approached and stood beside him. She was petite, and yet her body beneath its fetching Norman costume showed the rounded lines of maturity. At the edge of her mask her skin gleamed smooth and creamy. Her eyes were very dark and very bright. As Mr. Van Dam was a very circumspect young man, not given to the slightest familiarity with strangers, he confined his attention to an inoffensive inventory of her charms, and was doubly startled to hear her murmur, "You came in spite of all, monsieur." A French girl, he thought, no doubt one of those Creoles he had heard so much about. Aloud he said with a bow, "Yes, mademoiselle, I have been looking for someone like you." Her eyes flashed to the white gardenia on his breast, then up to his own. "You were expecting someone?" "I was. A girl to guide me through the carnival." "But you are early. Did you not perceive the warning?" "Warning?" he answered, confused. "I received no warning." "I feared as much," she said, "so I came. But it was unwise of you. It was madness to risk the streets." Her eyes left his face to scan the crowds. He fancied she shrank from them, as if fearing observation. Van Dam was puzzled. Her voice and manner undoubtedly betrayed a genuine emotion, or else she was a consummate actress. If this were some Mardi Gras prank, he felt a desire to see the next move. If it proved to be anything more, he fancied that he was too sophisticated to be caught and fleeced like a countryman. But something told him that this was no ordinary street flirtation. The words warning, risk, seemed to promise entertainment. If, as he suspected, she had mistaken him for someone else, a brief masquerade could lead to no harm. He decided to see how far he could carry the deception. "Oh, what warning could serve to prevent my seeing you?" he asked in a hollow voice, then was surprised at the flush that stole upward to the girl's dainty ear. "You are indeed insane to jest at such a time," she breathed. "I would never have known you without the flower. But come, we are in danger here. Someone is waiting. Will you follow me?" "To the ends of the earth," he replied gallantly. Again she gave him a startled glance, half of pleasure, half of deprecation. Then, as he made a movement to accompany her, she checked him. "Oh, no, no! You must let me go ahead. They are everywhere. They may suspect even my disguise. I am dreadfully afraid." Van Dam scarcely knew how to answer this. So, like a wise man, he held his tongue. "Listen," she continued, "I will walk slowly, and do you remain far enough behind for your own safety." "My safety is as nothing to yours," he told her, but she shook her head impatiently. "Please, please, they will never select you out of 1,000 dominoes, and I am not sure they suspect me. But should they try to lift my mask, you must escape at once." "Would they dare?" Mr. Van Dam inquired, shocked at such a breach of carnival etiquette. "They would dare anything." "But I couldn't allow it, really," he persisted. "If any hand is to lift your mask, I insist that mine be the favored one." She darted a doubtful look at him, being plainly perturbed at his tone, then shook her head. "She told me you were reckless, but you are quite insane." For a second time he discovered that delicious color tingeing her neck, and laughed, which disconcerted her even more. She hesitated, then turned away, and he fell in beside her. But distance proved only to enhance the girl's charms. Raleigh saw how beautifully proportioned she was, how regally she carried herself, how light and springy was her step. Although he had not seen her face, he somehow felt agreeably certain that she possessed a witching beauty. The circumspection with which she avoided the densest crowds made him wonder anew at the character of the danger that could overhang a masked maiden at mid-afternoon on a carnival day, for by this time he had forgotten his first suspicion. He thought not at all that the peril could be serious or in any way involve him, for the magic of the Van Dam name protected its owner like invisible mail. The effect of that patronymic was really quite wonderful. Policemen bowed to it. Irate strangers allowed their anger to ooze away before it. It smoothed the owner's way through difficulties and brought him favors when least expected. Rage changed to servility. Indignation, opposition, even jealousy altered color in the shadow of the Van Dam millions. Nothing really unpleasant ever happened to Raleigh, and so it was that he had become blasé and tired at 26. He followed his masked guide across Canal Street and into the foreign quarter of the city, where the surroundings were unfamiliar to him. He gazed with mild repugnance at the squalid old houses, mouldering behind their rusted iron balconies. Dim, flag-paved hallways allowed him a glimpse of flowered courtyards at the rear. Cool passages went twisting in between the buildings. Over hard-baked, glaring walls there drooped branches laden with bloom and fruit. The streets were narrow. The houses leaned intimately toward one another, as if exchanging gossip. Little cafes with sanded floors opened upon the sidewalks. Here the carnival crowd was more foreign in character. People were dancing to orchestras of guitar and mandolin. Youths turned somersaults for pennies. Ragged negroes jigged and shuffled with outstretched hats. Through this confusion the Norman girl took her way, now seeking some deep doorway to allow a particularly boisterous group to pass, now flitting through the open spaces with the swift irregularity of a butterfly winging its course through sunlit stretches. But her caution, her bird-like backward glances, told Van Dam that she was in constant dread of discovery, and involuntarily he lessened the distance between them. It was well, perhaps, that he did so, for just then a man in a domino like his own accosted the girl. Raleigh saw his guide shrink away, saw her turn and signal him with a swift, imperious gesture of warning. Instead of heeding it, he moved forward in time to intercept the stranger. The fellow was laughing loudly. He assumed a tipsy air and lurched against the girl. Then, with a quickness that belied his pose, he snatched at her mask and bared her features. She cried out in terror, and with the sound of her voice Mr. Van Dam flew to action. He knew that until 6 o'clock disguises were inviolate, and that it was against the strictest of police regulations to unmask a reveler. Therefore he yielded to a righteous impulse and struck the man in the domino squarely upon the jaw. Beneath Raleigh's rounded proportions was a deceptive machinery of bone and muscle that had been schooled by the most expensive instructors of boxing. He had known how to hit cleanly since he was 12 years old, and although he had never struck a man in anger until this moment, his fist went true. The fellow rocked stiffly back upon his heels and fell like a wooden figure, his head thumping dully on the pavement, and Raleigh gave vent to a most ungentlemanly snort of surprise and satisfaction. It had been easier than he had expected, and feeling that the man should have every opportunity for fair play, Raleigh began promptly to count 1, 2, 3. Then he felt the girl's hand upon his arm, and turned in time to catch a fleeting glimpse of a dimpled chin as she drew her mask down. "Rotten trick, that!" "Heaven above!" she gasped. "You must flee! Quickly!" People were crossing the street toward them, drawn by the sight of the fallen man. "Run away? And leave you?" queried Raleigh. "Hardly." "Then—" the breath caught in the girl's throat. "Come!" She clutched his hand, and they fled, side by side, pursued by half a score of shouting merrymakers. Around the first corner they scurried, into a crowd, then out of it and into the next thoroughfare, doubling and turning until the girl's breath was gone. "Why did you do it? Why?" she gasped, still hurrying him along. "Drunken loafer," Van Dam said, vindictively. He was not drunk. "Don't you understand? Didn't you guess? It was the Black Wolf." Raleigh did not understand, and he had no opportunity to guess who or what the Black Wolf might be, for his companion paused, crying, "God help us! They're coming!" From the street behind arose a babble of angry voices. "He saw me! He knows!" She cast a despairing glance about, and, spying a narrow alley close at hand, darted toward it, dragging Van Dam with her. Retreat carries with it a peculiar panic, and the young man felt the stirring of an utterly new sensation within him. He was running away! What was more, he wanted to keep running, even though he had not the faintest idea of what menaced him. It was quite remarkable. He seemed to feel, for some unknown reason, that this sprightly young person beside him was indeed risking her safety for him. Therefore he began to share her apprehension, but as to what it meant or whither the adventure was leading, he had not a suspicion. He did wonder, however, where the Black Wolf got his name. The alley was damp and slippery, being no more than a tunnel-like passage between two buildings, and it led into a large courtyard full of carts and wagons. A low shed ran along one side of the enclosure. At the rear was a two-story structure used as a stable. "There! I guess we've given them the slip," Van Dam sighed with relief. But his companion shook her head. "Oh, no, we must hide. The Black Wolf has the cunning of Satan, and now that he knows—" She sped through the confusion of vehicles to the stable door, with Raleigh following. An instant more, and they were in an odorful, dim-lit place, divided into stalls, out of which the heads of several horses were thrust in friendly greeting. The girl closed the door and leaned panting against it, one hand to her heaving bosom. Her head was bowed, and her ears were strained for sounds of pursuit. In the silence Van Dam heard his own heavy breathing, the swish of the horses' tails, an impatient stirring of hoofs, and a gentle whinny. He discovered that his pulse was hammering in a very unusual manner, and that he was agreeably excited. The girl uttered an exclamation. "Oh, I feared so! Hurry!" She slipped past him to a rickety stairway that led upward. "Ah, this mask is smothering me!" She disengaged it hastily, and he saw it dangling in her hand as he mounted the steep stairs behind her. He saw also a pair of dainty silken ankles, swelling into delicious curves that were hidden in the foamy whiteness of lingerie. Being an extremely respectful gentleman, Mr. Van Dam lowered his eyes, anticipating with curious eagerness the pleasure of beholding her countenance once they had gained the loft. The desire to see behind her mask became really acute. He had missed one opportunity by so narrow a margin as to quicken his desires. They came out upon a rough landing, and Van Dam caught the whisk of her skirts disappearing through a door that led into the haymow. As he followed, the door closed, and he found himself in utter darkness. He heard her fumbling with the lock. Their hands came together as he turned a rusty key, and he felt her figure close against his. Her fragrant breath fanned his cheek. "Make no sound, as you value our lives." As she whispered this, Van Dam swore mildly at the luck that prevented him from appraising his companion's good looks, now that her mask was off. From the courtyard below sounded voices. The girl clutched him nervously. Her hand was shaking. He could feel her shiver, so he slipped an arm about her waist. He did this merely to steady her, he told himself. He reasoned further that such a familiarity could scarcely be offensive in the dark. As she yielded gratefully to his embrace, her soft body palpitating against his own, he ceased reasoning and drew her closer. It was very agreeable to discover that she made no resistance. He could not recollect any sensation quite like this. As yet he had done nothing improper, in view of the fact that it was every gentleman's bounden duty to succor beauty in distress. He wondered if his friends at the Grunewald had missed him, then realized with relief that Miss Banniman never allowed his presence or his absence to interfere in the slightest with her arrangements. They were probably finishing their drinks by now. This would make an entertaining story later in the evening. They would never guess what he was doing. "Who is that speaking?" he inquired. "François, the spider," whispered the girl. "Oh, God, how they all have come to hate you!" Raleigh reasoned from these words that his enemies numbered more than one or two, and involuntarily he asked, "Hate me? What for?" The girl trembled. "As if you did not know." "And what would happen if they found me—us?" he persisted, feeling vaguely for some hint. "Ah!" Her breath caught. "Hush!" She laid her fingers over the lips of his mask. Van Dam yielded to an ungovernable impulse and kissed them through the stiff, harsh cloth, whereat she said in wonderment, "Heaven guard us! You are actually laughing! That you are wild I knew, but you act very strangely, monsieur." "Perhaps I'm intoxicated," he murmured, and pressed her slender waist meaningly, whereupon she seemed to feel his arm for the first time. She drew away, but as she disengaged his embrace, her hand encountered his. "It is wet, bloody, where you struck the black wolf." "That was a good wallop, wasn't it?" Van Dam chuckled with satisfaction, while she felt for her handkerchief and dabbled at his bruised knuckles. "I wondered if I could put him out." Then they ceased whispering, for some one was entering the stable beneath them. After a time the stairs creaked to a heavy tread, a hand tried the door, and they could feel a presence within arm's length. They stood motionless, not daring even to shift their weight upon the crazy floor, until the fellow began to explore the other portion of the loft. "That is the spider himself," breathed the girl, close to Van Dam's ear. "He thinks he has me in his web, but—" "Yes?" "I would die before I married him." A sudden dislike for spiders in general awoke in Raleigh's breast. "I hate him. I would kill him if I dared, but he frightens me." She broke off and caught at her companion, gasping, "Oh, God, what are you doing?" He had turned the key softly and was opening the door. To be quite truthful, Raleigh Van Dam did not know exactly what he intended doing, but some reckless impulse moved him to action. He was invaded by a sudden desire to lay hands upon this spider person who went about terrorizing pretty girls. Having been reared to a habit of doing exactly as impulse dictated, he felt no hesitation now. Away back in his mind, however, something told him calmly that he had gone quite mad, that the magic of adventure had sent his wits a-flying and had played havoc with his common sense. And a change really had come over him with the very beginning of this enterprise, although he had not stopped to notice it. The flaring rage that had answered to the wolf's assault upon the girl, the joyful sensation of setting his fist into the fellow's face, the excitement of the flight and the pursuit, had all combined to upset his equilibrium. Then, too, the presence of this bewitching creature close beside him in the darkness, the pressure of her body in his arms, the scent of her warm breath, all this helped to completely electrify him. He felt the dawning of new and utterly absurd desires. Away with discretion! To the winds with prudence! This maiden's cause was his. Here was the one glad moment of his life. "François!" he called in a low voice. He slipped the girl's hand from his arm, thrust her back into the shadow, and stepped out upon the landing. "Oui, in a moment." The spider came stumbling toward him. "She is not here." Van Dam saw a tall man in a domino like his own. "Sacre! She has disappeared, and that devil's spawn is with her. You found no trace in the yard below?" "Listen," breathed Raleigh. He sank his fingers into his palms and measured the distance carefully. Then, as François turned his head attentively, Raleigh braced himself and swung. It may have been due to the uncertain light or to the narrow eyelet holes through which he peered. At any rate, Van Dam's blow went short. The spider uttered a cry of fury and surprise. Raleigh felt himself hugged by a pair of thin, iron-muscled arms. Then his hands felt in beneath the man's disguise, and the cry changed to a gurgle. They strained and rocked against each other briefly. The floor sagged and creaked. The door behind them flew open. François was groping with one free hand at his waist, but his domino was like a shirt, and he could not find that for which his hungry fingers searched. As for Van Dam, a delicious ferocity was flaming through his veins. Here was an enemy bent upon his quick destruction. No game he had ever played was half so exhilarating as this. He could feel the fellow writhe and the breath bursting through beneath his fingers. He could feel the man's cords harden until they were like wire. Strange to say, with every wrench and every surge his own abysmal fury increased. But the Spider was no weakling. He fought desperately until, in a burst of blind anger that was like some diabolic glee, Van Dam lifted him bodily and hurled him at the opening in the floor. The fellow missed his footing, clawed wildly, then fell backward headlong into the light below. The next instant Van Dam, too, had lost his balance and followed, bumping from step to step, until he fetched up at the foot with a jar that drove the breath out of him. He sat up in a moment, still dazed. Then he heard a rustle, and beheld above him a pair of frightened, dark eyes gazing into his. Although he could see nothing of the girl's face, she had replaced her mask, he knew that she was racked with anxiety. "Are you killed?" she queried. "No, just abominably twisted," he said. Then, with a wry face, "Ouch! That was an awful bump." As he felt himself over gingerly, he stopped short at the sight of his mask lying crumpled beside him. He realized that the jig was up, and began to formulate an explanation of his deception, only to hear her exclaim tremulously, "God be praised you are unhurt!" He sat still, staring at her, amazed that no outburst followed her glimpse of his face. "How did you dare?" She turned to the figure of François, which Rolly discovered motionless an arm's length away. The Spider was sprawled loosely in the litter. His head was twisted upon his shoulders in a peculiar way, and his mask, having slipped to the back, stared upward with a placid, wax-like smile that was horrible under the circumstances. Still lost in wonderment, Van Dam arose, dusted off his clothing, and picked up his own disguise. Was it possible that she did not know the person she had gone to meet? It seemed so, indeed, for she was hanging upon him anxiously, as if still doubting his safety, while she half sobbed her admiration of his bravery and her gratitude at his escape. Raleigh began to fear he had been imposed upon after all, else how could she fail to realize that he was an utter stranger? But the girl's honesty was compelling. He found that he could not doubt the sincerity of her gaze. He felt an unaccountable lack of compunction regarding the Spider. In fact, he experienced a sense of satisfaction at the completeness of his victory over the ruffian, and she seemed to share the feeling. He heard her urging him to make haste, and before he had fully regained his wits, he found himself following her out into the sunlight. Underneath the wagon shed she guided him, around behind it, and into a narrow 3-foot space, the left side of which was bounded by a board fence about head high. "Quick!" she cried eagerly. "Once we are on the other side, we may escape. The others are somewhere close by." End of Story 1, Part 1. Story 1, The Crimson Camellia, Part 2. Van Dam, being accustomed by this time to a certain obedience, lifted the girl up to the top of the fence, scrambled over it himself, and held up his arms to her. He was in another yard, much cleaner than the one he had just quit. There were trees and flowers in it, and looking down on them were shuttered windows which seemed empty. As she surrendered her weight to him, he gave rein to the license which was in his blood, and pressed a warm kiss back of her mask, where the hair lay in wispy ringlets against her neck. "Mon Dieu, what a man!" she laughed, struggling gently to free herself. "You had better put on your mask. We haven't far to go, but there may be observing eyes." "Am I quite the person you pictured?" he queried, as he adjusted the false face. "Not at all." "You have never seen me before to-day?" "Of course not. How could I?" "I have seen you often." "Impossible. Where?" "Dreams," said Van Dam vaguely, yet with some degree of truth. This all seems like a dream, as a matter of fact. I'm afraid I'll turn over and you'll change into an old lady with hoop skirts, or a flock of purple snowbirds, or a friendly crocodile with gold spectacles." She pondered this for a moment as they made their way across the yard, being careful in the meanwhile to see if they were observed. After a moment she halted. "Wait," she said. "I'm not sure we dare risk going farther, for the streets are alarmed and the wolf is in the neighborhood with all his pack. I had thought to take you straight home, but now they will be watching. It would be madness to try it." Again she fell silent, only to exclaim, "I have an idea. Come." She turned abruptly to the right. "Where are we going now?" he inquired mildly. She pointed to a house, the back yard of which abutted upon the one that they were crossing. "Yonder is your cousin Alfred's house. He is away at business. The servants are out watching the carnival, and so it is empty. Do you dare venture it?" "Just the thing," he said amiably. "I owe Alfred a call." The girl laughed shortly. "Ah, he would die of rage or fright if he knew. But you can wait here while I go." "Oh, I say, you're not going to leave me?" queried Raleigh in genuine alarm. "Of course, silly. Someone must bring her." Van Dam fell silent, speculating upon this last remark. After a moment he said, "You're sure Alfred won't return?" "Who knows? We must run some hazards. The key will be under the step, I think. Come." They gained ingress to the next enclosure through a cedar hedge. Then, as they neared the back door, a distant commotion sounded from the stable yard, warning them that the Spider's friends had stumbled upon him. But the girl's ready fingers found the key where it was hidden, and an instant later they were in a spotless Creole kitchen, ornamented with shining pots and pans. A cat rose from a sleepy window ledge, arched its back, and stretched. With a warning gesture, Van Dam's guide bade him wait, then disappeared, returning in a moment. "It is as I thought. The house is empty." She beckoned him, and he followed her past a pantry, down a hall, and into a study furnished with a considerable degree of elegance. Drawn blinds shut out the glaring heat. It was dim and cool and restful. The maiden heaved a sigh of relief and steadied herself against one of the massive mahogany chairs, showing by her attitude that the recent strain had told upon her. "Heaven be praised, you are safe here for a time at least," she managed to say. "Nice, comfy place, this," remarked Van Dam, with an appreciative glance at the surroundings. "We can sit here and get acquainted, eh?" "I think I have learned to know you quite well in the past half hour," she laughed. "True, but we've had very little chance to talk calmly and rationally, now, have we? Of course, you're accustomed to such things, perhaps, but it has been a trifle strenuous for a person of my easy ways. I don't mind telling you that I'm positively winded. Let's rest a bit before you leave." But the girl shook her head at his suggestion. "You forget how she has waited and longed for this hour. She has been very ill. Nothing seemed to interest her until you promised to come on the last day of the fiesta. Since then she has been like another woman. She is counting the moments now until she feels your arms about her." Raleigh stirred uncomfortably, for here was something he had not counted upon. One woman at a time was ample. He had no desire to hold another to his breast. He was shocked, too, that this girl should suggest such a thing after what had passed between them. It was unseemly. He felt tempted to confess his deception and to demand an explanation of the whole affair. But some sense of shame held him back. Besides, his companion was undoubtedly sincere, and he could not bring himself to cause her dismay. Another reason that urged him to hold his tongue and to let the adventure run its course was that as yet he had not yet seen her face. The desire to do so was becoming insufferable. He was about to claim the privilege when she changed the current of his thoughts. "You must not be shocked if she does not recognize you. She has been ill, very ill, since you proved so great a trial to her. You understand?" "Perfectly," he said, thankful that she could not detect his signs of bewilderment. "Very well, then. You will make free of your cousin Alfred's hospitality while I am gone." She laughed nervously. "La, there is irony for you." "Suppose he should return in the meantime?" She shrugged. "You seem quite capable of caring for yourself, monsieur. I should not wish to be in his shoes, that is all. But there is little danger. And now I must leave you." "Just a moment," he said, taking her two hands in his. "You have seen my face. Don't you think I wish to see yours?" Her breath caught at the tone of his voice. "Not yet, please. When I return, when you have held her in your arms and made your peace, then perhaps if you wish, but not until then." She pressed his fingers meaningly, and he thrilled. "You haven't spoken my name either," said he. "Won't you tell me that you like me?" "I like you, Cousin Emile," said she. Then, in a voice that told him she was blushing rosily, "And what name do you give to me?" Raleigh's wits came to his rescue barely in time. With an air of deepest tenderness that was not all assumed, he said, "I haven't dared acknowledge the name my heart has given you, even to myself. It is—" "No, no," she laughed tremulously. "Call me Madeline. Madeline, desire of my dreams." He raised her hand to his lips. "Until you give me leave to lift your mask, I kiss these dimpled fingers." It was plain that his boldness did not altogether displease her, for she paused reluctantly upon the threshold. Her eyes were shining, although her mask smiled at him vacuously as she said, "You are a most unusual young man. You awaken something strange within me. I cannot despise you as I should, for you have taken away my reason. That is disturbing, is it not? Now, then, avail yourself of the hospitality of the man who has robbed you. I shall return as fast as ever my feet will bring me." She waved him a kiss and was gone. He heard the front door close. Then he endeavored to piece out some theory as to the cause of this situation. But the more he considered the clues in his possession, the more bewildered he became. One thing only stood out with alarming certainty. His cousin Madeline had gone to fetch a woman who loved him. So long as the adventure had concerned him only with the masked girl herself, he had been eager to continue it. Now that it threatened to involve a second woman, he decided it was time to go. She would return and find him gone. It would be a disappointment, perhaps, but not so great as his own at parting from her and leaving this mystery unsolved. He was somewhat proud of his exploits thus far, for in an hour's time he had met and bested two of his enemies and had changed a maiden's heart. No mean accomplishment for an idler. But why did she feel that she ought to despise him? Why had she risked so much for a man beloved by another? Why, under these circumstances, had she welcomed his advance and promised him a sight of her face, a kiss, perhaps? Above all, who were the Black Wolf, the Spider, and Cousin Alfred? He gave up puzzling over the affair and determined to get out of this stranger's house without delay. It was evident that Cousin Alfred was a person of substance, for the study was furnished in rich old Santo Domingo mahogany, blood red and flaming where the light struck it. The books were bound in uniform levant. The paintings were valuable, the bric-a-brac in irreproachable taste. An inlaid ivory humidor was filled with coronas at exactly the right degree of moisture. He removed the ground-glass stopper from an etched decanter and sniffed of the contents. The aroma brought a smile to his face, and, reflecting that the owner had robbed him, he took some time to pour out a drink and to light a fragrant cigar. All gentlemanly housebreakers did the like, he reflected. Then he yielded to whimsical notion and fumbled in his pocket, thinking to leave the price of his refreshments on the tray. Midway in this purpose he paused. The breath hung in his throat, the hair at the back of his neck seemed to rise. He had heard no one enter the house, there had been no faintest stir since Madeline had left, he detected no sound whatever, and yet he was positive that eyes were boring into his back, that he was no longer alone. It was ridiculous, and yet— A gentle cough sounded behind him. With a swift gesture he settled his mask back in place, and, whirling around, beheld the most evil-appearing human being he had ever seen. The man was little and stooped and undersized, all but his head, which was unusually large. His face was fleshless and covered with a tight skin of unusual pallor. He was bowing at Van Dam, but his smile was mocking, and his eyes glittered malignantly. "Good day, Monsieur Black Wolf," said the stranger harshly. "Making yourself at home with my wines, as usual, eh?" Van Dam felt the cold sweat leap upon his body. He cursed the deliberation that had betrayed him. With an assumption of indifference, he mumbled something and waved his cigar carelessly. "How often must I tell you to come here only at night?" snarled the old man. "Already the police are suspicious. Fortunately, it is Carnival Day. I dare say no one suspected you in that disguise." The speaker deposited his hat upon the table with a sour glance. Then, when his caller said nothing, he snapped, "Well? Well? What is it?" Van Dam was at a loss for words. He was panic-stricken, but swift upon his consternation came a reckless determination to take advantage of the old gentleman's first mistake and try to brazen the matter through. There was nothing to be gained by explanation. No one would believe his story. He spoke out boldly. "The wolf is hurt, and the spider, I think, has his neck very neatly broken. I came to tell you that your cousin Emile is in the city." The effect of these words was amazing, electric. Cousin Alfred turned a corpse-like green. He froze in his tracks. His eyes rolled in their sockets. "Emile? Here?" His teeth chattered. He plucked at his collar as if he were strangling. "Then who are you?" Raleigh shrugged. "I'm one of the others. I was sent to warn you." He recognized now the character of the old fellow's emotion. It was cowardice, terror, but of such utter foulness as to be disgusting. Evidently this Emile, whoever he was, had a reputation. Raleigh multiplied his host's discomfiture by adding, "Oh, yes, he struck down the wolf in the street, then dropped the spider on his head from the top of a staircase." "God help us!" stammered Cousin Alfred. "He will take me next. Oh, he has threatened me." He cast a frightened glance over his shoulder, as if expecting the sanguinary Emile to appear at any moment. Then he began to whine. "I know him, and the servant's gone. I am an old man. He wouldn't like nothing better than to find me alone. But how dared he come? Wait, it was Felice. Oh, I'll wager she sent for him, and he would not refuse, the scoundrel." The speaker's lips were wet and loose. His gaze was very evil as he mumbled along. Felice must be the other girl, the one for whom Madeline had gone, Raleigh decided. In view of Alfred's evident hatred, it did not seem right to allow Madeline to bring the other girl without some warning. One glance at those working features convinced the young man that such a meeting would be dangerous. And yet he was quite at a loss how to prevent it. His host was running on. "It was only yesterday that she appealed to me, she and Madeline, and all the time they knew he was coming." He ground his teeth. "I have been a fool to spare them so long." "This Felice," Van Dam ventured, groping blindly for some clue. "Your cousin Emile is fond of her, I judge?" "Damnation! He would pass through fire for her, and she would sacrifice her soul for him." Alfred poured himself a drink with shaking hand. The glass rattled against the decanter. He spilled the wine over his waistcoat as he gulped it. "So they planned to catch me napping, eh? But we shall see. Yes, we shall see." After a moment, during which he pulled himself together, he continued, "You shall remain here with me. When he comes, we shall afford him a surprise." He slid open a drawer in the big desk and took from it a revolver, at which Raleigh exclaimed, "I say, whatever makes you think he'll come here?" "Oh, he will come. There is no doubt of it. He has promised me that much. Those were his last words." "Why don't you clear out? You don't have to stay and see him." But the old man's eyes were red and vindictive as he shook his head. "You don't understand. So long as he lives, we are none of us safe, not even you. Besides, he would return again. He hangs upon me like a leech. I dream about him." "Well, what are you going to do?" If I should kill him, the law would say nothing. I could kill him very easily, and nothing would be said. You understand?" Cousin Alfred's lips were watery. Little drops of moisture gleamed upon his sallow face. He eyed the pistol with a shrinking fascination. I He fell to trembling weakly as his first desperation cooled. Van Dam watched him curiously. He looked up at length to meet Raleigh's gaze. His own eyes were wavering. His face was distorted with mingled fear and eagerness. He stretched his neck as if he already felt on it the fingers of his cousin Emile. When Van Dam did not offer to help him, he whined, "He has always intended to even up the score. But I am an old man. My hand is unsteady. Perhaps it would be worth something to escape those dreams. I could afford to pay you well, as you know. You are a strong man. You have no nerves. Your hand is sure." The old villain's expression was crafty. He was gnawed by a fierce desire that he was loath to put into words. "You mean you'd like to have me make away with him?" queried Van Dam, as if in a dream. "Well, yes. The law would say nothing." "How so? It's not so easy to kill a man, and—" "But the reward! $2,000. You would get that. I will double it, eh? Come now, is it a bargain?" The speaker was trembling, but when he received no answer, he went on. "I will take the blame upon myself. I will say that I did it, and you will get the money, $4,000. Let us say $5,000, eh? A tidy sum for a moment's work with no risk. We are alone in the house, and no one but the wolf knows you are here. Even I don't know. But, by the way, I haven't seen you yet." "Under the circumstances, I think I'll keep my mask on," Van Dam answered. "Perhaps the less you know about me, the better." "Then you agree?" queried the other, all ashake. Raleigh declined with a gesture. God, $5,000! A fortune indeed! Think of it! Heaven knows I am not a Croesus, and yet I might increase even that a little. What do you say? 6,000, then, all cash." "This is the money you stole from Emile, I believe," said Van Dam. "You could afford even more?" 7,500, chattered Alfred. "Not another cent, or I shall do it myself." "Good, you do it," Raleigh exclaimed, whereat the tempter writhed and shivered in an ague of fear. With a wail that came like a sob, and with a final wrench of his miserly soul, he exclaimed, "Wait, then. I will pay you $10,000 if you kill him. The money is there. It will bankrupt me, but, God above, $10,000! It is scarcely worth it. Such a little job." "How do I know you'd make good?" inquired the young man. "You robbed him. You might rob me." "I have promised. It is there, in the safe, the moment he is dead." "Bah!" Mr. Van Dam managed a mocking laugh, although his heart was pounding. "Your word is worth nothing to me." Alfred made answer by slipping across the room and kneeling before the steel safe. He spun the knob swiftly to right and to left, then gave a wrench, and the massive door opened. "Come here." Van Dam obeyed. "Look." He saw legal documents, deeds, mortgages, and blue envelopes, all neatly marked, then a cash drawer crowded full of symmetrical packages of crisp, new $10 bills, each with its bank band plainly labeled $1,000. "You are satisfied?" The owner was staring craftily up at him, careful to keep his body between Van Dam and the treasure. "Jove!" Raleigh exclaimed in astonishment. "You'll be robbed some night." "Is it a bargain?" "I'm no business man." The masker hesitated with an air of extreme suspicion. "Will you pay in advance?" At this Cousin Alfred uttered a bleat of dismay, but Raleigh was firm. "I'm not sure you'd open the safe again, don't you see? Besides, it would take time, and I'd prefer not to wait. Really I would, for I'm always a bit nervous after a job of this kind." "Listen, then," exclaimed the old man. "I will close the safe, but I will leave the combination off. See? We must each run some risk in this matter, I suppose. But I trust you. Once it is over, there will be no delay. A moment, and you can be away with $10,000 in your pocket, and with me to do the explaining." Why he had allowed the affair to run to such an extraordinary length Van Dam hardly knew, except that he wished to gain time. He had no idea that the mysterious Emile would really come to the house, for Madeline had as much as told him that a far different reason lay behind the young man's presence in the city. What did concern Raleigh, however, the more he considered it, was the possible consequence if the two girls returned. Thus far he had been able to meet each new surprise, each fresh situation, with a resource that amazed himself. But if they came face to face with him and Alfred, his own masquerade would end at once, and disastrous explanations would certainly follow. Nevertheless, he could not run away and leave them in an awkward position. As he looked back over the fantastic occurrences of the past hour or more, it amused and amazed him to realize how nicely he had fitted into the puzzle, and puzzle it surely was, for the whole sequence of events that had followed the purchase of the white gardenia that lay above his heart was now more bewildering than ever. That there was something more than mere roguery afoot he had ample proof. He felt himself groping along the edge of something vague and black and sinister. But what it was, what were the issues, or who were the people involved, he had not the slightest conception. Of one thing only was he sure: Madeline had no place in this elaborate web and woof of crime. She had impressed him more deeply even than he had realized, and his main anxiety now, outside of a desire to protect her from the venom of this poisonous old man, was to see her face, to lift with his own fingers the mask that had so tantalized him. The owner of the house was busily arranging the plans for Emile's destruction when the doorbell rang. He clutched his guest nervously by the arm and thrust the revolver into his hand, whispering, "It is he! The scoundrel has arrived! Quickly now, behind the door!" But Raleigh stepped to a front window and, cautiously drawing the curtain aside, peered out. He saw what he had feared, the figure of a petite Norman maid, and beside it that of a masked woman in a long, dark robe. "Well, now, who can it be?" he heard Alfred whisper, and discovered the senile villain peering past his shoulder. "It is Madeline and Felice," Raleigh explained. "They? Here? Oh, wait, I will give them a cursing to remember." But before the speaker could move, he found his arm pinioned behind him and his own weapon pointed at his head. He uttered a squeak of amazement and terror. "Mon Dieu, what is this?" "Shut up!" Raleigh dragged the old man from the window, stripped a thick curtain cord from its hook, and knotted his wrists together. Alfred offered no resistance. A horrible fear had him by the throat. He hung like a sack in the younger man's grasp. His eyes alone retained their activity. These followed Van Dam in a horrified stare. They seemed about to emerge from their sockets. Raleigh deposited his limp captive in a chair, and, stepping to the window, tapped sharply. When Madeline looked up, he signaled her to wait. The hall portières furnished another cord for Cousin Alfred's ankles, and a handkerchief served as a gag. As this was being adjusted, however, the captive quavered hoarsely, "Who are you?" "I?" Raleigh laughed. "Why, I am your cousin Emile." The householder voiced a thin shriek and began to plead for his life. Then the remnants of his strength escaped, leaving him a spineless heap in the great leather chair. Van Dam bore him in his arms down the hall, searching for a place of concealment. This he found in a closet, the door of which he closed. Then he hastened back to the front entrance. "You kept us waiting sufficiently," Madeline said, as he stepped aside for the two women to enter. Raleigh's eyes were glued upon the taller of the two figures, but Felice seemed to take no heed of him. He heard her murmuring in a sick, eager voice, "Emile, my own beloved Emile!" Madeline raised her hand in a warning gesture, and the young man shrank closer into the shadows. "Courage, dear," she said to her companion. "We have arrived at last. A moment now, and he will come." She half led, half supported the taller woman into the library. The next instant she was back at Van Dam's side. Drawing him into the parlor across the hall, she exclaimed in a voice which showed that tears were in her eyes, "Thank Heaven, no one recognized us, but I was weak with fright. Oh, it was pitiful. I have wept at every step. She has been calling you like that, night and day. Go, quickly." She removed his mask and thrust him into the hall. This was the most embarrassing moment Van Dam had experienced thus far. He had been prepared to face eventual discovery and had decided to make a clean breast of his part in this comedy when the necessary moment arrived, but this was altogether different. Felice was ill, half demented. What might be the effect upon her of this disclosure? There was nothing to do, however, but to face it out and to make the truth known as quickly and as gently as possible. But as he entered the study, he received a surprise that robbed the adventure of all its entertainment, that changed this comedy into a tragedy, and humbled the man's reckless spirit. End of Story 1, Part 2. Story 1, The Crimson Camellia, Part 3. Van Dam saw that which filled him with aching pity, for instead of a girl he found awaiting him a frail, sweet-faced old woman, whose fingers were locked as if in prayer, whose lips were murmuring the name of her son. Her hair, softer and finer than silken floss, was silvery white. Her wistful, wrinkled countenance was ablaze with a glad excitement that made it glorious and holy. That which caused Van Dam's heart to melt and to turn away completely, however, was the fact that she was blind. She had heard his step, muffled as it was in the inch-thick carpet, and rose with a tender cry, pausing with her arms outstretched, her body shaken by an ecstasy of yearning. "Emile! Emile!" she whispered, and came toward him. Her sightless eyes were wet. She was trembling terribly. Van Dam experienced a desire to flee. He tried to speak and to warn her off, but as the feeble figure swayed toward him, the age-old, appalling tragedy of mother's love caused his throat to tighten. Then he took her hands in his arms enfolded her. She lay against his breast, weeping softly, gladly, while he bowed his head reverently over hers. Had his life depended upon his speaking, he could not have done it. He merely waited, with a sick feeling of dread, the instant of her awakening. He was vaguely surprised as moment followed moment and it did not come. Then he discovered the explanation. Grief had set her wits to wandering. Days and weeks and months of yearning had burned away some part of her faculties, leaving her possessed by such a reasonless hunger that almost any object would have served to fill her want. He had heard of demented mothers whose minds had been saved by the substitution of a living for a dead child, and it seemed that this was a similar case, for she was flooded now with a supreme content and appeared to experience no suspicion of fraud. The touch of her fluttering fingers on his cheek was like the caress of butterfly wings. Her voice was soft, her words, though wandering, were tender, and filled with such a heaven-born adoration that his distress was multiplied. This was her hour, he reflected. Perhaps an all-wise Providence had selected him to fill this part and to bring glory to her withered heart. At any rate, he would have been unspeakably cruel to disillusionize her. He led her to a chair, then knelt and bowed his head to her straying fingers, murmuring those terms of endearment which cause a mother's breast to thrill. When he looked up to Madeline at last, she saw that he was crying, quite like a little boy. From the disconnected words that fell from the blind woman's lips he began after a time to piece the truth together. Emile had been an only son, a paragon of manly virtues, the keeper of his mother's soul. There had come a great shock and a great disgrace that had evidently conspired to unseat her reason. She spoke indirectly of them, as a child marked by some prenatal influence recoils at contact with the cause of its infirmity. Then, it seemed, Madeline had come to watch over and to comfort her, filling a son's place with a daughter's devotion. There had been persecution, want, the loss of property through an enemy of whom the mother spoke ramblingly. Van Dam recollected the dried-up villain in the closet down the hall, and felt a flame of rage mount through him. He longed mightily to ask questions, to run the matter down without delay, but dared not, for he was in momentary dread that the imposture would be discovered. So he spoke as infrequently as possible, and substituted for words those gentle caresses and endearing attentions that are far more welcome to a starving heart. Madeline remained close by, adding a grain of comfort and encouragement now and then, and regarding Van Dam with a strangely bewildered attention. But the mother was far from strong. Her excitement had wearied her, and now, with the relaxation of contentment, fatigue stole over her. She lay back among the soft cushions, her restless hands moving more slowly, her gentle voice stilled. She dozed at last, her face serene and beatific. Madeline motioned to Van Dam, and he rose. Noiselessly they stole across the hall and into the drawing-room, leaving the placid figure in repose. She turned upon him, saying doubtfully, "With every moment you surprise me, Emile. You are not at all what I expected, not at all the cousin of whom I have heard so much. Even in looks you seem, how shall I say it, strange." "Are you pleased or disappointed?" "Pleased. I feel that I must weep. You are so brave and strong, and yet so gentle, so sweet. Perhaps only a mother recognizes the good that is in one. That scene in yonder was very touching. I can hardly credit my ears and my eyes. It's plain you have a wrong idea of me. I'm not at all a bad sort. So I began to believe, in spite of everything. La, it is confusing. I'm all in a whirl." She uttered a hesitating, silvery little laugh that proved her embarrassment. "We must speak quickly," he said. "I am also greatly confused. You have opened up a great possibility for me, Madeline. This whole world is suddenly different. I think I am in love with you, my little cousin." She flung out her hand to check him, crying, "No, no, I could never love you." Her voice was uncertain, and he imprisoned her outstretched palm. Then, with his free hand, he removed her mask. She made no resistance. She did not even draw away from him. His heart leaped wildly at the face he saw, for it was more perfect even than he had imagined. The eyes were deep brown, the skin was smooth and olive-hued, the lips were red and pouting with embarrassment. She met his hungry gaze with a flaming blush of defiance. Then she smiled pathetically, and without further delay he drew her to him and kissed her once, twice, again and again, until she lay, spent and shaken, in his arms. After a time she said wonderingly, "What miracle is this? I have always hated you. I hate you now when I think of the evil you have done. I shall continue to hate you." "I hardly believe that." "It is very sad that this has come to pass. It means nothing but unhappiness." "How so?" "Can you ask? You, a refugee with a price upon your head?" She shuddered and buried her face against his shoulder. "Why have you made me love you?" "It was fate, my little witch. If you will trust me, all will come out right in the end. But there is a great deal here that I don't understand. For instance, how come you two to be in want?" "Surely you know as well as I." "I do not." "But I wrote. Letters go astray. Tell me." "There is little to tell. We hardly know ourselves, except that we trusted in our good cousin Alfred, as you trusted. He is a snake." She clutched Roland fiercely by the folds of his domino. "Oh, it is too bad that I did not know you sooner, Emile. I would have saved you from those evil men, for I am very wise. But now you must suffer the punishment for your crime, and I must suffer also. It is hardly just, is it?" "Suppose I told you I am innocent?" "Please." One rosy palm closed his lips. "You must never lie to me, even to promote my happiness. No, when a woman loves, she loves blindly, without reason, regardless of her lover's unworthiness. You have brought misery to me as you brought it to her. Perhaps you will suffer as a punishment." "And why have you devoted yourself to my mother?" he inquired. "I love her. I am alone in the world. We are poor together. Cousin Alfred has my money, too, you understand." Van Dam was tempted, as upon several former occasions, to tell her the truth, but a sudden idea occurred to him, an idea so inspiring, so brilliant, that it brought an exclamation to his lips. "Wait here for a moment," he said, and, leaving her, he stole into the library. With an eye upon the sleeping figure, he knelt before the safe and turned the knob. It opened noiselessly, and the sight of the close-packed cash drawer filled him with a tremendous merriment. It was exhilarating, it was godlike to be endowed with the power of restitution and retribution. He greatly enjoyed the feel of the crisp, new banknotes as he emptied the compartment and assembled the package into a bundle. He was amazed at the amount represented. There must have been $20,000, all in those smooth, unsoiled $10 bills. Evidently the old miser preferred lock and key to a banker's vagaries. Naughty Alfred, to rob widows and orphans. Well, he had been warned of the danger of robbery. Van Dam predicted apoplexy for the owner when he discovered his loss. The girl was waiting where he had left her, but when she discovered the nature of the gift he bore, she drew back in amazement. "Come, come," he said, "it belongs to you and Félice." "But, mon Dieu!" "I have prospered. A lucky speculation, a gift from the gods, as it were. You need have no hesitation in accepting it, for it is yours, and no one can take it from you, not even Cousin Alfred." She was still protesting when they heard the mother call. "This money! Another miracle!" Madeline exclaimed. "It is wonderful! I feel that I am dreaming. But come, we have overstayed. We may be discovered at any moment." He took her in his arms again and whispered his adoration. "I'm coming to find you, Madeline. I have the power to work miracles, you see." "No, no. If you care for me, you must guard yourself. Perhaps after many years, perhaps when you have shown yourself worthy and the world has forgotten, then—" She shivered at thought of the weary wait ahead of her. Her lips quivered pathetically. There were many things he wished to ask her. The hunger to retain her in his arms was almost unbearable. But now that she had been reawakened to the perils of their situation, she allowed him no opportunity. She tore her lips reluctantly from his. She held him off in an agony of pleading, and when the mother's voice sounded a second time, they returned in hand to the study. There followed a touching farewell as the blind woman clung shakingly to the gentle impostor, praying for his safety, imploring him piteously to be a good man and to walk in the shadow of righteousness. Then came a lingering, heart-breaking caress, and once more the three were at the front door. Van Dam seized the girl's fingers and kissed them, while the look in his eyes brought tears to hers. Then they were gone, and he stood alone in the hall of the house he had robbed. He remained motionless for a time, lost in a blissful intoxication. Was this strange, new-born delirium love? It must be. It could be nothing else. It was quite amazing, utterly bewildering. He had never dreamed of anything at all like it. He felt a desire to cry aloud the news of this marvel. He was melting with pain and gladness. Something inside him was singing gloriously. At thought of Madeline's deep, wide eyes, of her tender lips, dewy with the birth of passion, his muscles swelled and the whole world seemed to applaud. But it was so new, so unbelievable. The swift rush of this afternoon's events had left him in a dizzy whirl. An hour ago he had been deaf, dumb, and blind, but he had suddenly regained his every sense. He was no longer blasé. He was awake with yearnings and appreciations. Madeline had taught him the greatest secret of the universe. Madeline! But who the devil was Madeline? Van Dam brought himself abruptly out of his reverie. There had been enough mystery for one day. Now for the solution of this puzzle. Back yonder, gagged and bound, was a cringing human rat who knew everything Van Dam desired to know, and who would talk if forced to do so. Raleigh decided to have the inmost details of this affair, if it became necessary to roast the soles of Cousin Alfred's feet over a slow fire in order to loosen his tongue. Time had flown, but there was a little margin left. He hurried down the hall, flung open the door behind which his captive lay, then recoiled with mouth agape. The closet was empty. "Alfred!" he called. "Alfred!" But his voice echoed lonesomely through the empty rooms. Not a sound broke the silence. There on the floor lay the handkerchief and the two tasseled curtain cords. He felt a chill of apprehension, for unseen eyes were observing him, he was certain. With that vindictive little ruffian at large, the situation altered. Each door might hide a menace, each moment add to his peril. The thought of that rifled safe and the consequences of discovery convinced Van Dam that this was no place for a respectable New York society man, so he clapped on his mask and darted down the hall toward the rear of the house. Past the pantry and into the kitchen he fled, his precipitate haste nearly causing him to collide with another masked figure that had just entered from the garden. Instinctively the two men recoiled. Van Dam saw that the stranger wore a black domino like his own, and that a white gardenia was pinned over his heart. It was a twin to the flower that reposed upon his own breast. "Emile!" he exclaimed. With a start the newcomer swept his mask downward, and simultaneously he conjured an automatic revolver from some place of concealment. The face that he exposed was not pleasant to look upon, for it was coarsened by dissipation, and the eyes were both violent and furtive. Underneath his heavy, passionate features, however, lay a marked resemblance to the blind mother who had just left. "Yes, I am Emile," he panted. Then, with a snarl, he raised his weapon until it bore upon Van Dam's breast. "And you are one of the gang, eh?" "Here, don't point that confounded thing at me. It might go off." Raleigh brushed aside the mask from his own face, explaining, "I'm not one of the gang. I'm a friend." Emile eyed him intently before lowering his weapon. "I never saw you before." "Of course not. But come, we've both got to get out of here." "Indeed, I came to see my cousin Alfred. It is a little call I promised him." "I know everything, and believe me, you have no time to lose." "How do you come to know so much?" demanded Emile suspiciously. "And what is that?" With the muzzle of his weapon he indicated the waxen white flower upon Raleig's domino. "There's no time to explain everything, but I know why you are here. The old man has gone." "Gone? Bah! That is a lie. I have followed him all through the city. I've been to his office, and they told me he was here. I've a little matter to settle with him. It will only take a moment." "I tell you he's gone." "Who the devil are you, anyhow? I have no friends." "I am Madeline's fiancé," Van Dam said boldly. "Another lie. She has no fiancé." The speaker's face darkened. "If she marries anyone, it shall be me." An unfamiliar pang smote Van Dam suddenly, but he disregarded it. "Don't be a fool," he insisted. "I know why you came here, but you're too late. Your mother and Madeline were here, too, a moment ago." "Here?" exclaimed the youth incredulously. "Yes. Alfred heard you were in the city, and he planned to ambush you. I tied him up and threw him into a closet. Then I robbed his safe and gave the money to Madeline and your mother." Emile's face was a study at this amazing intelligence. "When I came to look for the old fellow a moment ago, I found he'd escaped. I don't know where he has gone. That's why we'd better cut and run for it before he sets up an alarm." "Run?" Emile shook his head. "I have been running, with the Black Wolf at my heels. I thought they had me cornered more than once. They're after me now, the whole pack." "Do they know you're here?" "I dare say. They were right behind me." He cursed violently. "And to think that I missed Cousin Alfred after all." "You had no business in the city. You must get out again." "It's too late now. Why, it's nearly 6 o'clock. I could never get away before it's time for masks off." "Nevertheless, you must try," Van Dam said decisively. "If you stay here, you're lost. We'll climb the fence at the rear of the next yard and slip out through the stableway." Emile pondered for a moment. "I hadn't thought of that. It's a chance. But you can't go with me. I shan't allow it." "Nonsense." "You don't know the wolf. If I were seen it would mean the death of both of us." "Very well, then. I'll leave by the front way. Now go." Van Dam half shoved the young man toward the door. "Thanks," murmured the fugitive. "You seem to be the right sort. If I live I shan't forget." The next instant he was gone. Raleigh watched him race across the yard, squeeze through the hedge, then an instant later saw his form as he mounted the fence to the wagon enclosure where the spider had gone to his destruction earlier in the afternoon. It was a risky route to safety, he reflected, but in view of what Emile had said about his pursuers, it was infinitely preferable to any other. Why he had helped the fellow Van Dam scarcely knew, unless it was because of his sympathy for the underdog. Whatever the boy had done, he possessed a reckless bravery that was commendable, and he still held his mother's love. Raleigh was about to close the door when he saw a second man in a long black domino briefly silhouetted upon the fence. Then he heard a whistle. The fellow dropped over into the tracks of Emile, leaving the New Yorker amazed at the apparition. A sickening fear clutched Van Dam, but he knew it was useless to cry out. Could it be that he had sent the young fellow to his death? When a moment, then another, had passed with no sound from that quarter, he closed the kitchen door and retraced his steps swiftly to the front of the house. As he came to the library entrance, he found it closed, and from inside he heard a tinkle as if a telephone hook was being violently agitated. Inclining his ear, a low, agonized voice came to him. "Le Duc, again! Why haven't you sent the police? Robbery! My cousin Emile! Murder me! God above, they are slow! He will escape!" Van Dam tried the door. It was locked. Then he called sweetly, "Alfred, my dear cousin Alfred!" The voice at the telephone ended in a shriek. There came a crash as the instrument fell from the old man's fingers. So the police were on their way. Escape, then, must be but a matter of moments. With his heart pounding, Van Dam stepped into the drawing-room and reconnoitered from a front window. What he saw did not reassure him, particularly in view of Emile's words, for directly opposite he beheld a masked man in a black domino who looked very like the Black Wolf. Scattered up and down the block were others, all idling about in a seemingly objectless manner. Evidently the house was surrounded. He dared not risk the back way after what he had seen. He could not remain. From the library again came that faint, frantic tinkling. Van Dam dropped his mask, tore the flimsy robe from his back, and strode to the front door. Under any other circumstances he would have preferred to remain and to take the consequences, but for Madeline's sake he dare not risk an explanation to the police. Besides, how could he explain that $20,000 in clean, crisp $10 notes that she had in her possession? He flung the portal wide, stepped out, then turned and bowed as if to some one inside. "Good-bye," he called cheerily. "Had a delightful afternoon." The door closed with a click, and he was in the open air. He extracted a cigarette from his jeweled case, noting from the corner of his eye that with one accord the maskers were closing in upon him. Descending the steps, he turned to the left, walking briskly. His one chance now depended upon whether these men knew Emile by sight. If so, he felt that he was reasonably safe. If not, he was approaching two of them. They separated to let him pass between. From beneath their fatuously smiling masks he saw eyes staring at him curiously. The flesh along his spine crinkled and rippled, but he did not turn his head or falter, even when he knew that they had halted. He could feel the puzzled gaze of many eyes upon him, and imagined the mystification his appearance had excited. In the midst of their indecision there sounded the faint clamor of a gong. It grew rapidly until, with wild clangor, a patrol wagon reeled into the street and drew up in front of the house Van Dam had just quitted. He turned as a half-dozen bluecoats tumbled out of it and rushed up the steps. Incidentally, he saw that the black-clad figures were melting away in various directions. Raleigh did not wait to observe what followed. He turned the first corner, then quickened his gait, at the next corner swinging once more to the left. His pulses were jumping, his ears were roaring, he found the muscles of his jaws were aching from the strain. A close call, surely. But he had come through it all safely. He was whole and on his way out of this mysterious neighborhood. Once more his promptness and resource had saved him. Here was the very street up which he and Madeline had fled. Yonder was the entrance to the blind alley that led into the stable yard. He noticed that a little crowd was congregated there, many of its members in the same costume of merrymakers. He reflected that Emile might have found their presence awkward in making his escape. They seemed greatly excited or shocked over something, he noted, as he approached. They completely blocked the alley entrance. In among them he forced his way, then paused, staring down with startled eyes at what he saw. A babel of voices smote his ears, but he heard nothing. He was elbowed aside, but his gaze remained riveted upon the body of a man in a black domino. It lay sprawled in the dirt, and covering the face was a mask which smiled placidly up at the beholders. On the left breast was pinned a solitary gardenia, crimson with blood. It had been pierced with a dagger, and out of it had trickled a bright red arterial stream. Van Dam continued to stare at the gruesome sight while his wits whirled dizzily. Why, it was but a moment ago that this boy had left him in the full flower of his youth. The body was still warm. It seemed inconceivable that the grim reaper could have worked this grisly change in so short a time. How had it happened? He recalled that somber figure as he had seen it scaling the fence. He recalled that warning whistle. At the memory he turned sick. Was it possible that he had been to blame for this? He shook the notion from him, reflecting that Emile's fate would have been the same, or worse, had he chosen any other course. Arrest, he knew, would have been no more welcome than this. Raleigh felt a great desire to shout the truth at these people who stood about so stupidly. He longed to set them on the trail of the Black Wolf and his pack, but he refrained. How little he really knew, after all. Who was the Black Wolf? Who was this Emile? What had the young scapegoat done to place himself not only outside the law, but outside the good graces of those conspirators? What intricate network of hatred and crime was here suggested? The desire to know the truth overcame all thought of his own safety, so he began to question those around him, heedless of the fact that he was being hunted in this very block. The crowd was growing. An officer returned after sending a call for an ambulance and began to force the people back. Van Dam discovered a voluble old woman, evidently a shopkeeper, who seemed better informed than the others, and to her he applied himself. "Do I know him, indeed?" she cried shrilly, in answer to his question. "And who should know him better than I? Emile Le Duc, a fine boy, sir, of the very best family. Think of it, to be murdered like this! Ah, that's what comes of a bad life, sir. But right at my own doorstep, as you might say, and in the light of day. Well, well, what can you expect? He must have been mad to return with the whole city knowing him so well." She was greatly excited, and her voice broke under the stress of her feelings. "It doesn't help the neighborhood, you understand, to have such things happen," she ran on, "although nobody can say it's not as quiet and respectable hereabouts as the next place. You've noticed as much yourself, I dare say. Nothing ever happens. A misfortune to all of us, I call it. Why, it's barely 2 hours ago that they brought a poor fellow out of this very alley with his head lolloping around like a ball on a string. He fell and hurt himself, I hear, although he looked perfectly dead to me. Think of that! 2 in one day. Oh, it doesn't help the neighborhood, although there's nobody in the whole block as would do another injury, unless it might be that poor boy's cousin, the old rip who lives in the fine house through yonder. He's a bad one, far worse than Emile, if I do say it, who never speaks ill of my neighbors. And there's others besides me who'll be sorry it isn't him instead of the young man who lies there with a hole through his ribs. Why, I thought he was some masquerader up to his carnival pranks, or drunk, perhaps, until I noticed him all over blood." Van Dam drew the speaker into her shop, which was near by, then handed her a banknote. "Come, I want you to tell me all you know." "Oh, a detective, eh? Not that I wouldn't tell you all I know without this. $10, is it? Peace and love. You are generous. Well, then, he has stood right in your tracks in this very store many's the time. Law, what a lad he was. Nothing bad about him, but just reckless, we used to think. Of course, that was before we learned the truth." "What do you mean?" "You must be a stranger. Why, the whole world knows the scandal. It made a commotion, I can tell you. But the poor lad, he's paid for all his evil deeds. Why, sir, he was dead when he walked out into the street. He must have been a corpse even when I took him for a merrymaker. Strange things do happen on these carnival days. They must have finished him with one stroke. Ugh!" "They? Whom do you mean?" The old woman winked and wagged her head sagely. "Oh, you'll never learn who, but we know. You think the gang was broken up when Emile went to prison. But where do all these counterfeits come from, eh? Answer me that. There's not a week goes by that one of 'em doesn't find its way into my store. They're perfect, or nearly so. It would take a bank teller to find a flaw. I'm always frightened to death till I work them off again. For all I know, this very $10 bill you gave me is bad, but I'll risk it. Some people don't seem to mind them at all, and so long as there's a chance to get rid of 'em, why, I don't object. But that's how it all came about, through counterfeit money, sir. They used Emile for a cat's paw, so I've heard, but when he was caught, they let him take his punishment. It was his cousin, Alfred Leduc, who got him to confess under promise of a light sentence. They do say the old rascal fooled him into it. For what reason, nobody ever knew. Anyhow, they sent Emile away for 10 years. He threatened to turn state's evidence, and perhaps he would have done so if he hadn't escaped." "Ah, so he broke jail." "Exactly, and they've been hunting him ever since, with a reward on his head, and all the time the counterfeits are still coming in, and the police are as far from the truth as ever. Poor boy, there he lies, dead, with a flower over his heart. And I saw him fall. This will kill his mother. She's blind, you know, and very feeble." "He has a cousin, Madeline, I believe," Raleigh ventured. "Ah, then you know her. A blessed angel, with a face like a picture and a heart of pure gold. Hark!" The old lady listened. "There go the clocks striking 6. That means masks off and the end of the carnival. Too bad, too bad. And Emile with a flower over his heart." Like one in a dream, Roland Van Dam emerged from the foreign quarter into the broad reaches of Canal Street. He had been gone nearly 3 hours. The pavements were strewn with confetti and the litter of a Mardi Gras crowd, but nowhere was a masker to be seen. Directly ahead of him loomed the Grunewald, a splendid tower of white brick and terra cotta. Inside were his friends awaiting him, perhaps. He realized with a sinking sensation that Eleanor Bannerman was among them, and that he had asked her to be his wife. What a change 3 hours had brought to him! Why, in that brief interval he had lived through all those very emotions, the existence of which they had both denied earlier in the day. Life had opened for him, and he had seen it in the raw. On his hands was the blood of a fellow man, on his lips the fragrance of a kiss that set his veins afire. "I say, Raleigh, where have you been?" Miss Bannerman's strident voice demanded as he entered the café. "Bless my soul!" exclaimed her father, waving his prospective son-in-law to a chair with a pudgy hand. "We thought you were lost in the tall grass. You missed tea, but you're in time for a cocktail. Eleanor is quite cranky if she misses hers." "Beastly stupid place, don't you think?" Miss Bannerman inquired of her sweetheart. "Oh, I haven't found it so," Raleigh said, with a sigh of relief. "Fact is, I've been quite entertained." "You have such absurd taste. A dash of absinthe is mine, if you please, waiter. Papa has ordered the car attached to the evening train, and we're dining aboard. What do you say to Pinehurst and a week of golf?" Raleigh felt a sudden distaste for Pinehurst, for golf, for all the places and people he had known. "Lovely," he managed to say. Then, summoning his courage, "I'll join you later, perhaps. Sorry to break up the party, but I've a little business here that will take a day or so." "Business? You? How funny!"
exclaimed Eleanor. "Too bad," her father said. "It's bloomin' hot here, and the flies are awful." The others joined in commiserating the young man. When they arose to go upstairs and prepare for the train, Raleigh fell in behind them with Miss Banniman. "See here, Eleanor, are you sure you love me?" he asked. She lifted her brows slightly. "Not at all. What put such an idea into your head? You're a charming boy, even if you are a bit romantic. But love? I thought we understood each other." "I've been thinking. Something unusual for me. And I don't believe we're either of us quite ready to take the fatal plunge. How does it strike you?" "I'm in no hurry," Miss Banniman said indifferently. "Let's call it off for the present. We can try it on again in the autumn if we feel like it." "Mighty sensible of you," Van Dam told her, with relief. "Oh, that's all right. Don't let this keep you away from Pinehurst, however. The season's nearly over, and we'll need you for a foursome." She extended her hand, and Van Dam took it gratefully. Her father called from the elevator, "See you in a few days, Raleigh. Good luck with your business, and don't take any bad money." Mr. Banniman's use of slang was neither brilliant nor original, but he was chuckling as the car shot up out of sight. Van Dam hastened to the desk and called for a city directory, then ran through it to the L's. Ah, there it is. Le Duc, Felice, widow, residence 247 Bull Street. He made a note of the address, then settled his hat upon his head, lit a cigarette, and walked jauntily out into the evening, and turned toward Canal Street. It was growing cool, the street lights were gleaming, long rows of them were festooned for blocks in all directions, blazing forth in fanciful designs. In a short time now the Rex Parade would be under way, with its countless floats depicting the Age of Romance. "Romance, indeed," smiled Mr. Van Dam, contentedly. "Why, this was the age of romance." Something recalled Mr. Banniman's parting words to him. "Bad money." The young man paused abruptly. "Bad money? What a coincidence!" He pictured a safe sunk into a library wall, an open cash drawer jammed with neatly pinned packages of crisp, new $10 banknotes. Then he recalled the story of the garrulous old shopwoman. Raleigh came to himself with a jerk. He began to laugh. "Good Lord!" he said aloud. "I wonder if Cousin Alfred's money was counterfeit." He was still smiling as he bought a white gardenia and placed it in his buttonhole. End of Story 1, Part 3. Story 2, Rope's End, Part 1. A round moon flooded the thickets with gold and inky shadows. The night was hot, poisonous with the scent of blossoms and of rotting tropic vegetation. It was that breathless, overpowering period between the seasons when the trades were fitful before the rains had come. From the Caribbean rose the whisper of a dying surf, slower and fainter than the respirations of a sick man. In the north the bearded, wrinkled Haytian hills lifted their scowling faces. They were trackless, mysterious, darker even than the history of the island. Beneath a thatched roof set upon 4 posts was a table, spread with food, and on it a candle burned steadily. No wind came out of the hot darkness. The flame rose straight and unwavering. Under a similar thatched shed, a short distance away, a group of soldiers were busy round a smoldering cook fire. There were other huts inside the jungle clearing, through the dilapidated walls of which issued rays of light and men's voices. Petithomme Laguerre, colonel of tirailleurs in the Army of the Republic, wiped the fat of a roasted pig from his lips with the back of his hand. Using his thumbnail as a knife blade, he loosened a splinter from the edge of the rickety wooden table, fashioned it into a toothpick, then laid himself back in a grass hammock. He had expected to find rum in the house of Julian Rameau, but either there had been none, or his brave soldiers had happened upon it. At any rate, supper had been a dry meal, only one of several disappointments of the day.
The sack of the village had not been at all satisfactory to the colonel. One yellow woman dead, a few prisoners, and some smoldering ruins. Surely there was no profit in such business. Reclining at ease, he allowed himself to admire his uniform, a splendid creation of blue and gold which had put him to much pains and expense. It had arrived from Port-au-Prince barely in time to be of service in the campaign. As for the shoes, they were not so satisfactory. Shoes of any sort, in fact, cramped Colonel Petithomme Laguerre's feet, and were refinements of fashion to which he had never fully accustomed himself. He wore them religiously in public, for a colonel who would be a general must observe the niceties of military deportment even in the Haytian army, but now he kicked them off and exposed his naked yellow soles gratefully. On three sides of the clearing were thickets of guava and coffee trees, long since gone wild. A ruined wall along the beach road, a pair of bleaching gate posts, a moldering house foundation, showed that this had once been the site of a considerable estate. These mute testimonials to the glories of the French occupation are common in Hayti, but since the blacks rose under Toussaint Louverture they have been steadily disappearing. The greedy fingers of the jungle have destroyed them bit by bit. What were once farms and gardens are now thickets and groves. In place of stately houses there are now nothing but miserable hovels. Cities of brick and stone have been replaced by squalid villages of board and corrugated iron, peopled by a shrill-voiced, quarreling race over which, in grim mockery, floats the banner of the Black Republic, inscribed with the motto, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. Once Hayti was called the Jewel of the Antilles, and boasted its little Paris of the West, but when the black men rose to power it became a place of evil reputation, a land behind a veil, where all things are possible and most things come to pass. In place of monastery bells there sounds the midnight mutter of voodoo drums. The priest has been succeeded by the papaloi. The worship of the Virgin has changed to that of the serpent. Instead of the sacramental bread and wine, men drink the blood of the white cock, and so it is whispered, eat the flesh of the goat without horns. As he picked his teeth, Colonel Petithomme Laguerre turned his eyes to the right, peering idly into the shadows of a tamarind tree, the branches of which overtopped the hut. Suspended from one of these was an inert shape, mottled with yellow patches where the moonbeams filtered through the leaves. It stirred, swayed, turned slowly, resolving itself into the figure of an old man. He was hanging by the wrists to a rawhide rope. His toes were lightly touching the earth. "So, now that Monsieur Rameau has had time to think, perhaps he will speak," said the colonel. A sigh, it was scarcely a groan, answered. "Miser that you are!" impatiently exclaimed the colonel. "Your money can do you no good now. Is it not better to part with it easily than to rot in a government prison? You understand, the jails are full. Many mulattoes like you will be shot to make room." "There is no money," faintly came the voice of the prisoner. "My neighbors will tell you that I am poor." Both men spoke in the Creole patois of the island. "Not much, perhaps, but a little, eh? Just a little, let us say." "Why should I lie? There is none." "Bah! It seems you are stubborn. Congo, bring the boy." Laguerre spoke gruffly. A man emerged from the shadows of the base of the tree and slouched forward. He was a negro soldier, and with musket and machete shuffled past the corner of the hut in the direction of the other houses, pausing as the colonel said, "But wait, there is a girl, too, I believe." "Oh, yes, monsieur, the wife of Floréal." "Good, bring them both." Some moments later imploring voices rose, a shrill entreaty in a woman's tones. Then Congo and another tirailleur appeared, driving ahead of them a youth and a girl. The prisoner's arms were bound behind them, and although the girl was weeping, the boy said little. He stepped forward into the candlelight and stared defiantly at the blue and gold officer. Floréal Rameau was a slim mulatto, perhaps 20 years old. His lips were thin and sensitive, his nose prominent, his eyes brilliant and fearless. They gleamed now with all the vindictiveness of a serpent, until that hanging figure in the shadows just outside turned slowly, and a straying moonbeam lit the face of his father. Then a new expression leaped into them. Floréal's chin fell. He swayed uncertainly upon his legs. "Monsieur, what is this?" he said faintly. The girl cowered at his back. "Your father persists in lying," exclaimed Laguerre. "What do you wish him to say?" "Oh, a little thing. His money can be of no further use to him." "Money?" Floréal voiced the word vacantly. He turned to his wife, saying, "Monsieur le Colonel asks for money. We have none." The girl nodded. Her lips moved, but no sound issued. She also was staring, horror-stricken, into the shadows of the tamarind tree. Her arms, bound as they were, threw the outlines of her ripe young bosom into prominent relief and showed her to be round and supple. She was lighter in color even than Floréal. A light scar just below her left eye stood out, dull brown, upon her yellow cheek. Laguerre now saw her plainly for the first time, and shook off his indolence. He swung his legs from the hammock and sat up. Something in the intensity of his regard brought her gaze away from the figure of Papa Rameau. She saw a large, thick-necked, full-bodied black, of bold and brutal feature, whose determined eyes had become bloodshot from staring through dust and sun. He wore a mustache and a little pointed, woolly patch beneath his lower lip. Involuntarily the girl recoiled. So." The barefoot colonel rose and, stepping forward, took her face in his harsh palm, turning it up for scrutiny. His roving glance appraised her fully. "Your name is—" "Pierrine." "To be sure. Well, then, my little Pierrine, you will tell me about this, eh?" "I know nothing," she stammered. "Floréal speaks the truth, monsieur. What does it mean, all this? We are good people. We harm nobody. Everyone here was happy until the blacks rose. Then there was fighting, and this morning you came. It was terrible. Mamma Cléomélie is dead. The soldiers shot her. Why do you hang Papa Julien?" Floréal broke in hysterically. "Yes, monsieur, he is an old man. Punish me if you will. But my father, he is old. See, he is barely alive. These riches you speak about are imaginary. We have fields, cattle, a schooner. Take them for the Republic. But, monsieur, my father has injured no one." Petithomme Laguerre reseated himself in the hammock and swung himself idly, his bare soles scuffing the hard earthen floor. He continued to eye Pierrine. Now that young Rameau had brought himself to beg, he fell to his knees and went on. "I swear to you that we are not traitors. Never have we spoken against the government. We are colored, yes, but the black people love us. They loved Cléomélie, my mother, whom the soldiers shot. That was murder, monsieur. She would have harmed nobody. She was only frightened." The suppliant's shoulders were heaving. His voice was choked by emotion. "She is unburied. I appeal to your kind heart to let us go and bury her. We will be your servants for life. You wish money, good. We will find it for you. I will work. I will steal. I will kill for this money you wish. I swear it. But old Julien, he is dying there on the rope." Floréal raised his tortured eyes to the black face above him. Then his babbling tongue fell silent, and he rose, interposing his body between Pierrine and the colonel. It was evident that the latter had heard nothing whatever of the appeal, for he was still staring at the girl. Floréal strained until the rawhide thongs cut into his wrists, his bare yellow toes gripping the hard earth like the claws of a cat until he seemed about to spring. Once he turned his head, curiously, fearfully, toward his young wife. Then his blazing glance swung back to his captor. The silence roused Laguerre finally, and he rose. "Speak the truth," he commanded roughly. "Otherwise you shall see your father dance a bamboula while my soldiers drum on his ribs with the cocomaque." "He is feeble. His bones are brittle," said the son thickly. As for you, my little Pierrine, you will come to my house. Then, if these wicked men refuse to speak, perhaps you and I will reach an understanding." Laguerre grinned evilly. "Monsieur," with a furious curse, Floréal flung himself in the path of the black man. The wife retreated in speechless dismay. Petithomme thrust young Rameau aside, crying angrily, "You wish to live, eh? Well, then, the truth. Otherwise—" "But she, Pierrine," panted Floréal, with a twist of his head in her direction. "I may allow her to go free. Who can tell?" He led the girl out across the moonlit clearing and to the largest house in the group. He reappeared, making the door fast behind him, and returned, stretching himself in the hammock once more. "Now, Congo," he ordered, "let us see who will speak first." Taking a pipe from his pocket, he filled it with the rank native tobacco and lighted it. The tirailleur he had addressed selected a 4-foot club of the jointed cocomacaque wood, such as is used by the local police, and with it smote the suspended figure heavily. Old Julien groaned, his son cried out. The brutality proceeded with deliberation. The body of old Julien swung drunkenly, spinning, swaying, writhing in the moonlight. Floréal shrank away. Retreating until his back was against the table, he clutched its edge with his numb fingers for support. He was young. He had seen little of the ferocious cruelty which characterized his countrymen. This was the first uprising against his color that he had witnessed. Every blow, which seemed directed at his own body, made him suffer until he became almost as senseless as the figure of his father. His groping fingers finally touched the candle at his back. It was burning low, and the blaze bit at them. With the pain there came a thought, wild, fantastic. He shifted his position slightly until the flame licked at his bonds. Colonel Laguerre was in the shadow now, watching the torture with approval. Maximilien, the other soldier, rested unmoved upon his rifle. Floréal leaned backward and shut his teeth. An agony ran through his veins. The odor of burning flesh rose faintly to his nostrils. "Softly, Congo," directed the colonel after a time. "Let him rest for a moment." Turning to the son, he inquired, "Will you see him die rather than speak?" Floréal nodded silently. His face was distorted and wet with sweat. Laguerre rose with a curse. "Little pig, I will make your tongue wag if I have to place you between planks and saw you in twain. But you shall have time to think. Maximilien will guard you, and in the morning you will guide me to the hiding-place. Meanwhile, we will let the old man hang. I have an appetite for pleasanter things than this." He turned toward the house in which Pierrine was hidden, whereat Floréal strained at his bonds, calling after him, "Laguerre, she is my wife! By the Church, my wife!" Petithomme opened the door silently and disappeared. "Humph! The colonel amuses himself while I tickle the sides of this yellow man," said Congo in some envy. "I don't believe there is any money," Maximilien observed. "What? Am I right?" He turned inquiringly to Floréal, but the latter had regained his former position, and the candle flame was licking at his wrists. "To be sure, this is a waste of time. Make an end of the old man, Congo, and I will take the boy back to his prison. It is late, and I am sleepy." The speaker approached his captive, his musket resting in the hollow of his arm, his machete hanging at his side. "So now, don't strain so bitterly," he laughed. "I tied those knots, and they will not slip, for I have tied too many yellow men. To-morrow you will be shot, monsieur, and Pierrine will be a widow, so why curse the colonel if he cheats you by a few hours?" Congo was examining his victim, and uttered an exclamation, at which Maximilien paused, with a hand upon Floréal's shoulder. "Is he dead?" "The club was heavier than I thought," answered Congo. "He brought it upon himself. Well, the prison at Jacmel is full of colored people. This will leave room for one more." Maximilien's words suddenly failed him. His thoughts were abruptly halted.
for he found that in some unaccountable manner young Rameau's hands had become free, and that the machete at his own side was slipping from its sheath. The phenomenon was unbelievable. It paralyzed Maximilian's intellect during that momentary pause which is required to reconcile the inconceivable with the imminent. It is doubtful if the trooper fully realized what had befallen, or that any danger threatened, for his mind was sluggish, and under Rameau's swift hands his soul had begun to tug at his body before his astonishment had disappeared. The blade rasped out of its scabbard, whistled through its course, and Maximilian lurched forward to his knees. The sound of the blow, like that of an axe sunk into a rotten tree trunk, surprised Congo. A shout burst from him. He raised the stout cudgel above his head, for Floréal was upon him like the blurred image out of a nightmare. The trooper shrieked affrightedly as the blade sheared through his shield and bit at his arm. He turned to flee, but his head was round and bare, and it danced before the oncoming Floréal. Rameau cleft it, as he had learned to open a green cocoanut with one stroke. On the hard earth Maximilian was scratching and kicking as if to drag himself out of the welter in which he lay. Floréal cut down his father and received the limp figure in his arms. As he straightened it, he heard a furious commotion from the campfire, where the other tirailleurs were squatted. From the tail of his eye he saw that they were reaching for their weapons. He heard Laguerre shouting in the hut, then the crash of something overturned. As he rose from his father's body, he heard a shot and saw the soldiers of the Republic charging him. They were between him and Pierrine. He hesitated, then slipped back into the shadow of the tamarind tree and out at the other side. His cotton garments flickered briefly through the moonlight, then the thicket swallowed him. His pursuers paused and emptied their guns blindly into the ink-black shadows where he had disappeared. When Colonel Laguerre arrived upon the scene, they were still loading and firing without aim, and he had some difficulty in restoring them to order. Blood they were accustomed to, but blood of their own letting. This was very different. This was a blow at the government, at their own established authority. Such an appalling loss of life seldom occurred to regular troops of the Republic. It was worse than a pitched battle with the Dominicans, and it excited the troopers terribly. Perhaps he had been mistaken, and there was no money, thought the colonel, as he returned to his quarters after a time. Of course, the girl still remained, and he could soon force the truth from her, but she was the only source of information left now that Floréal had escaped, for Laguerre had noted carelessly that the body of Julien had hung too long. It was annoying to be deceived in this way, but perhaps the day had not been without some profit after all, he mused. The road to the Dominican frontier was rough and wild. All Haiti was aflame. Every village was peopled by raging blacks who had risen against their lighter-hued brethren. Among the fugitives who slunk along the winding bridle paths that once had been roads, there was a mulatto youth of scarcely 20 who carried a machete beneath his arm. In his eyes there was a lurking horror. His wrists were bound with rags torn from his cotton shirt. He spoke but seldom, and when he did, it was to curse the name of Pédéaume Laguerre. End of Story 2, Part 1.